to a private banking cartel. There had to be something in it for the government, right?
Of course. And in a word, it's money and lots of it. Raising taxes is a way to create revenue for the government, but not without a lot of political fallout, or even political suicide. Fiat money, on the other hand, is a way for the government to acquire instant purchasing power without actually increasing taxes. This, in fact, is why the government entered into the Federal Reserve cartel with the bankers. The Federal Reserve Act permits the Fed to create money out of thin air.
This kind of money is called fiat currency, money issued by decree.
This fiat money is then lent to the government.
So when the government needs $100 billion to pay for the Iraq War, the Fed creates the money out of thin air, essentially by writing a check.
This check would bounce if you or I tried to do the same kind of thing. But since the Federal Reserve Act was passed into law, it's okay for this private banking cartel to write such a check.
In fact, such an arrangement makes both the Fed and the government very happy.
The bankers can collect interest on the fiat money that was created from nothing. And the politicians have tons of money to spend without having to get it from the people by doing something very politically unpopular, raising taxes.
Thus the Fed and the government have a partnership which is beneficial to both. Now, Dick, correct me if I'm wrong, but the government could just print the money it needed directly without borrowing it, and that would eliminate the need for the Fed, right?
Right. In fact, bills have been introduced in Congress many times to abolish the Fed, but none has even come close to being enacted. There is plenty of money flowing into the politicians' pockets to be sure that never happens.
Well, Dick, it's nice to know that our politicians are well fed.
Yes, we certainly have the best government that money can buy. But while the rest of us stagger under the burden of our debt-based economy, by law the government-borrowed money must be repaid. Much of that obligation becomes the national debt, which today is well over an incredible $9 trillion.
By the way, Dick, just who is going to pay back this staggering debt?
Not only who, Rick, but how and when.
Well, I think we'll leave that to our viewers' imagination. So, Dick, besides an astronomical national debt, who cares if trillions of dollars are created from nothing? What does it mean to the average American? Consider this. If you worked hard enough in 1913 to earn $1, you could have bought a full-course meal with it back then. If you put that dollar under your mattress and took it out today, it wouldn't even buy a 20-ounce bottle of water. Most people would attribute this difference to so-called inflation, or what they think is rising prices. But the real cause is the Federal Reserve inflating the money supply. The more money in circulation, the less value it has. Inflation is actually a hidden tax. If the Fed had never existed, the value of the dollar would be the same today as it was in 1913, and people's life savings would be preserved instead of destroyed.
Rick, in this chart of the U.S. price index for the last 200 years, we can see that the dollar retained its value consistently from 1800 right up until the Federal Reserve went into operation in 1913. Notice that the value dropped substantially each time there was a national emergency, such as a war or economic depression. And each time the gold standard was suspended. When gold was taken out of the equation completely, as in 1971, the value of the dollar dropped much more sharply and has continued to decline steeply ever since.
The value of real money remained constant well before 1913. With an ounce of gold in ancient Rome, for example, you or I could have bought a top-of-the-line toga, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of sandals. With 1 ounce of gold today, we can go to a men's clothier and purchase a top-of-the-line suit, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of shoes. The price in real money hasn't changed in all these years. But with the fiat money, the value of Federal Reserve notes continues to plummet because the Fed keeps putting more and more of them into circulation.
And the price of gasoline hasn't changed any either, if measured in real money.
You mean they had gasoline in ancient Rome, Dick?
No, but they had it here 60 years ago.
And 60 years ago, gas cost 26 cents a gallon. but in May of this year it was $4 a gallon and projected to go to $7 a gallon.
That's what it's costing us in paper dollars, Rick. But you could have bought 10 barrels of crude oil with a 1-ounce gold coin in 1948, and you can still buy the same 10 barrels of oil with a 1-ounce gold coin today.
Don't tell me. The Federal Reserve again, right?
Right. The Federal Reserve, flooding the world with ever more worthless Federal Reserve notes instead of real money. But the globalists and the government don't want us to know this.
And so you won't see this in the news.
Which goes to show you that we wouldn't need the Fed at all if we were on the gold standard, backing up our money with real value.
Dick, it's important to remember that fiat money has nothing of value to back it, so that purchasing power can come only from taking it from somewhere else. That somewhere else is from the consumer via the inevitable and increasing decline in our purchasing power. We think of inflation as a natural rise in the cost of living and expect our incomes to rise along with it. But it is an invisible tax drawn from diminishing purchasing value and is used to support the system of financial terrorism that is the Federal Reserve. Yes, sir, the bankers follow the model of the European central banks very well indeed.
So we have seen who benefits from the Federal Reserve.
Those behind the cartel, the money scientists and the bankers, getting all that interest on nothing.
And the Congress, who have a well of unlimited revenue that they use to exert more power over the people.
So who loses because of the Fed?
Rick, it's the people, as always. We can say with assurance that most of the major problems of the world, widespread hunger and poverty, perpetual war, even genocide, are the direct or indirect result of the central bank's control over national economies. The full story of exactly how the bankers cheat the American public out of trillions of dollars is too long to tell here, but the basic idea is very simple.
Let's say you get approved for a $100,000 mortgage. The bank hands you a check for that amount and charges you an annual interest rate of 6% over the next 30 years.
After the 30 years, you will have paid back the principal of $100,000 plus just under $116,000 in interest.
And here's the kicker. Not 1 cent of that loan came from a tangible asset of any kind.
The bank simply created that $100,000 out of thin air, just like the Fed does when it writes a check to the government. The money comes into existence only when it is borrowed. Incredibly, this is what the Federal Reserve Act made perfectly legal. The borrower received $100,000, for which he paid an interest rate of 6%. However, when we calculate the interest rate the banker received, we are in for a shock. If the borrower had ran away with the money and never paid it back, the bank would not have been out 1 penny. The bank's liability, therefore, was 0. We learn in grammar school how to calculate interest rate. It is the amount of interest paid divided by the amount of the liability. When you divide by 0, the answer is infinity. The bankers, therefore, obtain an infinite interest rate. Over the years, since the Federal Reserve Act was passed, the interest that the bankers have collected totals trillions and trillions of dollars, and the bankers have become rich beyond comprehension.
It is mathematically impossible to sustain such a system. Sooner or later, the debt will become so enormous that it will consume all the productivity of all the people. Everything will collapse into an economic black hole. Dick, I think our viewers should ask themselves this question. If the information they've heard here about the Federal Reserve is new to them, why didn't they learn about it in school? And why don't they read about it in the mainstream media?
Because the government controls the public schools and the media, and they don't want you to have this information.
So if our viewers think we're just talking nonsense here, they have probably gotten this impression from the media's propaganda machine. It's time to get the real news and do a reality check, or they will be forever in the dark.
Rick, it is estimated that since the birth of the Federal Reserve, the bankers have cheated the American people out of some $20 trillion in interest on loans made from money created out of thin air.
G. Edward Griffin has called that a river of money.
And that river of money just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Dick,